This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this event today. I'm sure that you will find it both fun and stimulating. As many speakers, introducers do when new speakers come up, I want to tell you about the time I first met Rabbi David Wolpe. He was about 22 inches long and 8.5 pounds. I was actually 19 months old, so I don't actually remember the first time that I met David Wolpe. But one of the joys of being a brother is to watch as your brother grows into a leader and someone who both commands the respect and the love of his congregants and of people all over the country, both through his writing and his speaking. David is the senior rabbi at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, California. He is a very frequent contributor to television, print, radio, and other media. He's on Mysteries of the Bible and other shows in which he tries to explain in both layman's terms and yet somehow in beautiful prose some of the ways in which our legacies from long history of Jewish thought about the nature of religion and the nature of the world affect us today. He's an ethics columnist for Campaign and Elections magazine, a monthly book columnist for the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles. He appears on PBS and A&E and a bunch of other shows. And most importantly of all, I think, David is a leader in American Jewry. He was picked by Newsweek as the #1 congregational rabbi in the United States. They also had a separate list of general Jewish leaders in which he was number 8. I think he was only one of 2 rabbis who made both lists. So David's voice is not only one that helps explain Judaism to Jews, but also one that is an important liaison between the wisdom that Judaism has offered for many, many centuries to the outside world. And I find that particularly helpful to me because as someone in bioethics who's often called upon to talk about Jewish bioethics, that is something I do in a very different context, which is at times it's my job to try to explain how Jewish insights into bioethical issues can inform general bioethical debate. So in that sense, watching David is often very educational for me in my own work as well. I've read David's book. It's really fascinating. I encourage you to read it. It is part of a debate going on right now that is a very important debate in the United States and I think all over the world about the nature of faith in a technological age. So with that, by way of introduction, I'd like to introduce you to Rabbi David Wolpe.
Thank you. I want to first thank the new director of the Ethics Institute for what I understand to be his first act of unethical nepotism in bringing his brother to lecture here. For the most part, he really is very ethical, but there's no excuse for this, really. Nonetheless, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak. And what I want to do today is to talk about 2 separate issues that I try to marry together in the book. One about the question of faith in general in an age in which many assumptions about faith are under assault. And this in a whole series of books, some of which are more familiar, but there have been a lot of books published in Europe as well that are books of anti-theist philosophy and theology, and also talk about faith in a religious way, which is not quite the same as talking about it in a sort of abstract argument. And that is one of the points that I hope to make along the way, but in fact I'll start off with it, that really when you talk about faith, you don't tote up column A and column B. Nobody decides that they're going to be a faithful person because after all the arguments seem better on this side. And even though I'm going to give you a sort of state of play argumentation about faith, the way that I think of faith is it's an orientation towards the universe. It's the way that you see. And that's why so many people come to faith through models as opposed to arguments. Because they say, you know, the way this person looks at the world fits me. And the fact that there are discrepancies between the way the world is and my philosophy, that doesn't actually, you know, I say in the book that for years I've been teaching courses in Jewish philosophy and in general religious philosophy, and we always give the proofs for God, the ontological proof and the cosmological proof and the teleological proof. Nobody ever comes up after class and says, that did it, now I believe. Because they're proofs that are persuasive to somebody who's persuaded, but since it is an orientation towards life, it's not simple enough. It's not simply a consequence of trying to figure out whether the logical consistency of each position coheres better than the logical consistency of the opposite position. Having said that, we have the better case. And I want to take, I think, two separate areas about religion, although there are many, and I'm sure in the conversation we will discuss many. One is the area of religion and violence, and the other is the area of morality. And just talk a little bit about those two areas, and then wrap it up with a story. So first, let me talk about violence. What I hear all the time in religious disputations, in fact, just heard it last night. I was at Harvard, and I had a debate with Steven Pinker. And his argument was that as the world gets less religious, it will become more peaceful. And I don't think so. And one of the reasons that I don't believe that that's true is I don't think that religion actually introduces violence to the world. And I want to make a historical argument and then an argument from human character. The historical argument is as follows. When you talk to somebody who traces the history of religion and conflict, you always hear the Crusades, the Inquisition, all the terrible things that happened in the Middle Ages, as though when Christianity came into the world, and here we're talking about the monotheistic faiths, warfare did too. But I invite you to consult with any ancient historian about Assyria and Babylonia and Rome and Greece, and you will discover that the world was a bloody, savage place before religion came into the world. Now, there were polytheistic religions, it's true, but Caesar didn't go into war in order to honor Mars, the god of war, right? Caesar went into war to honor Caesar. And when he was genocidal, which he was, nobody said to him, how could you do that? After all, you're a Roman. Since that's what Romans did, right? They killed people until sometimes even past the point that people surrendered, as you can remember from Carthage, right? Rome fought until there wasn't a Carthaginian left standing. Why? Because that was what Rome did. And the martial values of Rome, the military values of Rome, the idea that Romans should fight, that was what sustained Rome, according to the greatest ancient historian, Gibbon. And what is it that made Rome fall in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire? It was Christianity. Because along come all these Christians, and they preach pacifism and self-abnegation. And they say fighting is not good. And it saps this warrior spirit from the Romans, so all of a sudden, this empire that relied on the Roman infantry and the perimeters of Rome, where dedicated Roman soldiers held off the barbarian hordes, too many of them converted to Christianity, and that was the end of the empire. Now, Gibbon may or may not be right, but he certainly perceived an important value shift. And I say this because, you know, Gibbon was no Christian and didn't like Christianity and thought that he was criticizing Christianity by saying this. And you get an echo of that at the beginning of the modern age, when Nietzsche says the same thing, right? You know, well, I'm going to return. Remind me, I'm going to return to Nietzsche in a minute because he's important in this story. But in the modern age, after the French Revolution, when the religious influence of the world starts to drain, and people no longer feel that religion has a say in public polity, and it's expelled, what you get then is a world replunged into savagery far beyond anything that you could have imagined in the Middle Ages. I had this dialogue with Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic in Washington about a month ago. And when I gave this little spiel, he said to me, "Are you defending the Inquisition?" And I'm not defending the Inquisition. Right? It was a bad thing, the Inquisition. They ought not to have done it. I just want to make that clear. I'm not defending it, and nobody expects it. But thank you. That was a little Monty Python reference there, and my brother, God bless him, picked it up. So it's a genetic quirk. I don't know it. But having said that, the Inquisition in 400 years killed a few thousand people. It was a terrible blight on European history. But we're talking about a relatively minor number compared to the Napoleonic Wars, compared to the French Revolution, compared to World War I, World War II, communism, Nazism. I mean, the scale of slaughter is so ridiculously, wildly disproportionate to anything that the church had ever done, even during the terrible religious wars that led up finally to the Peace of Westphalia, which was the worst of Western religion, that you have to ask yourself, why is it that when the modern age began and religion retreated from the public sphere, the world got so much worse? Because it did. And in fact, the explicitly atheistic regimes of Europe were almost down the line explicitly the regimes that thought of human life as having no value. And this idea that religion, even when there is interreligious war, still there lurks within religion the sense that human life has an ultimate value, seems to me to be the real explanation of why it is that religion alone can't be held responsible for the savagery of human beings, and in fact sometimes tempers it. I will tell you, though, what is responsible for the savagery of human beings, since if you're going to take religion out of the equation, you have to find, right, an alternate explanation. It's us. It's human nature. Anybody who thinks that human beings are basically good should visit a playground. Right? And there you will see what happens when a new kid comes onto the playground. Right? What do the other children say? Oh, look, a new child. Right? Let us embrace him and share our toys. No, it doesn't. It's like a new kid. Go get him. Because we have an instinctive distrust of the other. It's deep in human nature. You know, Rodgers and Hammerstein have this song about how hate has to be carefully taught. It's not true. If hate had to be carefully taught, then it wouldn't be so hard to get your kids to be good. Why do you reward your children over and over and over and over again when they share? Why do you always have to say to them, share, share, be good, don't hit, do this, do that? Because it's the opposite. That is, goodness has to be carefully taught. Civility and decency have to be carefully taught. That's what has to be carefully taught. Nobody has to teach a kid to be selfish. They do that on their own. You have to teach them to be selfless. And therefore, when you have a religious regime and it does something wrong and people say, aha, it's religion, all I can tell you is religion doesn't always work, but it's working with very recalcitrant material. It's not working on, it's not going with the grain. It's what Kant said. Right? He said, of the crooked timber of humanity, it's very difficult, or he said impossible, to make something straight. So that's what religion is fighting for and against. That is, against, which is why in Christianity you have the concept of original sin. In Judaism you have the concept not of original sin, but I would say of original splitness. Judaism believes that every human being has a good and an evil inclination, and they are at battle with each other all throughout our lives. And I think that however you want to configure your psychology, anybody who believes that people are just basically good and then they get messed up, like this Rousseauian ideal, by civilization, that I don't think it holds anymore. We know too much about human nature, and we've seen human beings in too many different ideal utopian venues that inevitably fall apart to think that that's possible. And this leads to the question of morality in general. And here I could talk. Yes?
You told us to remind you about Nietzsche.
Yeah, thank you. Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. We're getting to him right now. Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. So it's a famous line in The Brothers Karamazov where Ivan Karamazov says, without God, anything is possible.
And this is part of the crux of the debate. When Dostoevsky says, without God anything is possible, he's saying it with trepidation, right? He's scared what's going to happen without God. Nietzsche says the same thing, but he's happy. Nietzsche has, remember the madman, going through the streets proclaiming that God is dead. But for Nietzsche, that's a sign of liberation. But both of them get the same result, which is, without God, anything is possible. And it's, I think, no coincidence that Dostoevsky saw it in Russia, where anything became possible, and Nietzsche saw it in Germany, where anything became possible. Right? Where the two most horrific regimes that you might want to add China to that, in the history of humanity, certainly in scale, communism and Nazism came to be, Stalinism in particular, and Nazism. And why is it? I think that this idea is powerful, and you hear it again and again in these debates. Last night, the way that I posed it was, I tried to make it as non-freighted with, it's not that every atheist is going to be a Nazi. And sometimes religious people, their rhetoric becomes so overheated that their case is, obviously, someone who's an atheist can be as good a person as somebody who's religious. There are a lot of lousy religious people. There are a lot of wonderful atheists. I think we can dispense with that right now. I'm not talking about individuals. Individual moral standards vary widely. But I want to know why, from the point of view of somebody who thinks there is no God, ought I to act against my interest? Because when I've had these discussions, invariably interest gets located, morality gets located in evolutionary strategies. That is, my reputation is on the line, and my reputation matters in the world. If I'm good to you, you'll be good to me. As a collective, if we're good to each other, society will benefit. All that is true, but none of that tells me when it's not in my interest. Why is it? The example I gave last night was, I went to a restaurant that I will probably never go to again. I will never see that waitress again. Why should I leave her a tip? Why should I do it? It's not in my interest. It diminishes my resources. And if you do it, and you really push yourself to the wall, you have to figure out why. Now, if I push myself to the wall, the reason I do it, honestly, is because I believe that's what I'm here for. I'm here to grow in soul. And you don't only grow in soul by sitting on a mountaintop. You grow in soul in interaction and relationship with other human beings, even if that relationship is evanescent, even if it's just for a second and then it's gone. But if that's not true, if we came from nothing and we return to nothing, and we are accidents of ancient chemistry and sophisticated animals, then why should I care? Now, you may say to me, you probably will, somebody almost always does, and yet I still feel like I should be moral. So how do you explain that? And my answer is that philosophical assumptions take a while to percolate through societies. But percolate they do. You know when Keynes said that our assumptions about the world are just the theories of some dead economist, right? The same thing is true here. That is, philosophy matters. It just takes a while to matter. It doesn't happen right away. But if you raise generation after generation of people with the idea that the reason they're good is because it's a survival strategy, because it's, evolutionarily sensible as opposed to philosophically mandated or divinely inspired, sooner or later they will understand that goodness is a strategy and not a demand. It's what John Gray, who is an atheistic philosopher in England, says. He says, your genes serve evolution, not truth. Now, that's a frightening statement. And if people believe that, then you get frightening consequences from it. So it's not just an argument. It really is a posture towards the world when you decide whether you're someone who has faith or not. And granted that somebody who has faith, and I do want to say this, someone who has faith doesn't have all the answers. And not everything is good for them. And it isn't true that faith makes life, serious, thoughtful faith, makes life instantly easier, and that's why people have faith. I always get this in arguments. That is, I explain my beliefs by reason and the other person's by psychology. Right? I believe what I do because it makes sense. You believe what you do because you're a weak person, or you had a bad mother, or an inadequate father, or you grew up in the wrong place or something. So yours can be explained, whereas mine makes sense. But the truth is that being a person of faith doesn't necessarily make your life easier. You struggle with different questions in a different way. I mean, after all, if this world is all about, genes and all about evolution, then there's no problem of evil, because it's exactly what you would expect. It's a jungle, and people behave like it's a jungle. Whereas a person of faith has to constantly struggle with the question of why is there evil, and maybe we'll get to that in the questions. I'm going to leave that aside for the moment. But having said that, I do want to just close by making this personal. I opened the book by talking about being at the bedside of someone who was dying of cancer. And I've had a lot of cancer in my immediate family. My wife had cancer several months after my daughter was born, and had surgery and is now fine, but that was life-threatening and made it impossible for us to have more children. Several years later, I had a brain tumor and neurosurgery, and a couple of years after that, lymphoma and chemotherapy. And so I asked myself, especially as I was going through chemotherapy, which was the most extended of these episodes, I asked myself, so do you believe because you're afraid? After all, it's awfully nice to have a lifeline when you're not sure if the chemo is going to work or how long it's going to work for, which I still don't know, right? I'm in remission, which I tell my congregation is true of all of us, except that I know it. But still, it's scarier to know it. And here is what I honestly believe. I didn't believe for a second that if I prayed to God, God would cure me. I don't believe God works that way. I don't think God says, okay, listen, Wolpe in bed 6 prayed. Him I'm going to take care of. Bed 3, I've not heard word 1. Sorry, that's it for bed 3. I mean, really, when you think about it, if God answers prayers, God certainly doesn't answer prayer in any way that we can conceptualize that would make sense to us. Not only that, but everybody in this room, I'm sure, knows of people who have had tremendous undeserved suffering or death, and if God answered prayers, that wouldn't have happened. I keep moving back one line. There, if I turn that off, can you still, that way you don't get an echo from the two mics. But going through chemotherapy did deepen my faith. And not because I thought I was being cured, but because when you go through something powerful, and especially right after I was diagnosed, when I went to the worst place that you can go when you are diagnosed, which is called the internet, right? And you should never go there. And I saw that I had like 7 minutes to live based on, everybody who'd ever had my exact condition. I put it right in. But especially right after I was diagnosed, and in those first terrifying weeks, something cracked open inside me that was only open for a brief while, that allowed me to connect to other people and to God in a different way. And it closes up. It never completely closes, because once you've had an experience, it never disappears. But I understood that when they say there are no atheists in foxholes, first of all, it's not true, and second, it's not true for the reason that you think. It's because in extremis, you have a piece of you that you can get to that you can't get to at other times. And that piece is the part of you that is, I think, the core of what connects us to God. And it's not about argumentation. It's about the essence of what a human being is. And it's about the belief that you can transcend yourself. And part of what makes people not believe in God is that they don't believe in people. That is, they don't believe when they look in the eyes of somebody that they're seeing something that can't be explained biochemically, something that is intangible and transcendent. But that's the piece of you, I believe, that we have periodic, not constant, but periodic access to that allows us to reach towards God. And then I promised I would close with a story, and I want to do that now and then take questions or comments. It's the story I closed the book with, and And I tell it because it's very powerful, and it's also it's also a story that actually I told in a previous book called Why Be Jewish, but I thought the audiences would be different, so nobody would be too upset if I retold it. And besides, it's a good story. You can always tell a good story twice. In the Jewish tradition, there really isn't exactly a parallel for the Christian idea of hell. But there is a version, so to speak. And it comes from a valley outside Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom. And in that valley, pagans who lived at the time of ancient Israelites used to sacrifice their children. We can still unearth the altars, actually. Archaeologists have unearthed the altars in Hinnom, which is right outside the walls. You can see it if you go to Israel today. And about 15 or 20 years ago, archaeologists excavating in that valley found the home of an Israelite that was destroyed around the time of the destruction of the first temple, which is 586 BCE. So we're talking about a good 600 years before Jesus, 700 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. They found the oldest bit of parchment by 600 or 700 years, the oldest bit of scripture that exists in the world. They took months with chemical appliances to unroll these scriptures, and when they did, what they found was 2 small amulets that contained the priestly blessing from the book of Numbers, which is, may God bless you and keep you, may God's countenance shine upon you and be gracious to you, may God turn his countenance to you and grant you peace. Which means that the oldest legacy of religion in our world is snatching a blessing of peace from the midst of hell. And that is precisely what religion at its best can do. It can go into a world in which there is a great deal of pain and suffering and loss and bring meaning and purpose and peace. And if religion succeeds in doing that, as it does, I would argue, again and again and again in people's lives over and over, all over the world, then we won't have to actually ask the question about why faith matters. Thank you. So you have a mic and I have a mic? Yes, please.
My name is Ari. I'm a biologist over here on campus, and I work in the Ethics Center, so you can't say anything too bad to me because I work with your brother, or maybe that's a reason too. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot. First of all, I agree that faith matters. But I'm kind of interested, and I've been writing and thinking a lot lately about the relationship between science and faith. And I was a little bit worried or bothered, and maybe have you comment on this, what I detected as a defensive tone, as this kind of science equals atheism thing. And do you see yourself, I haven't read your book yet, but is this a defensive posture that you're taking, especially with your comments about biochemistry and genetics as
right.
kind of equal to atheism?
No, it's not intended to be. I mean, my belief is that the more we understand about the way God created the world, the more it ought to increase our wonder and sense of wonder about the world, both not only in biology, but in physics, and also, I think, in consciousness. That is just the miracle that, I think of it as an analogy, the miracle that just as we live really most of our lives in intangibles, and the intangibles affect the material world, I see that as a sort of analogy for the way God works in the world. Because it is, after all, the central declaration of religion that the greatest reality is intangible. So I am defensive to the extent that somebody argues for pure materialism, but not science. So, yes. Now, he can't say anything bad because he's acknowledged in the book. I just want to say that. This is Dr. Melvin Connor. He teaches here, and he's not responsible for the science section, but I did check it with him. I just want to, that's all.
Well, I think it's a wonderful book, and but I am not responsible.
Right. I know. I didn't say you agreed with everything. I just said.
Right. I want to say that the only problem with your brother's ethics is that how hard did he twist your arm to get you to grace us with your presence and your wisdom.
Thank you.
I
really came for my niece. My niece
okay.
is here. I had to come see my niece.
Very good. No ethical problem.
Right.
So my question is, if argument doesn't matter, What advice do you have for a person who has no faith or has suffered a loss of faith to come to faith?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because I don't want to say that argument doesn't matter. Argument does matter. I just don't think it's decisive for most people. And the only way that I know of to come to faith is to live a faithful life. That is, to be in community, to pray, to meditate, to seek God, and to live a life of goodness and giving. Because I actually think that the process of giving brings you much closer to faith than, I mean, I'll just say something I'll use myself as an example. For years, I taught at universities before I went to a synagogue. And part of the reason that I did that is because if you go to a synagogue, you have to actually spend an awful lot of time worrying about other people's problems, right? Or as I remarked one day to my wife after I'd gone to several life cycle events of my congregants, I feel like I'm living other people's lives, right? But the truth is that that's exactly how, that I'm living a life of much deeper faith than I was when all I had in front of me was a classroom of students who changed every year. Because when you see people who are sick, who are dying, who are giving birth, who are new parents, who are getting married, and you see the wonder and the beauty in their lives, and you're a part of it in some way, I think it brings home the wonder of the world we live in and the spiritual essence of that world, the spiritual force that moves through that world much more powerfully than a detached life does. So, at least as I understand it, actually, a life of faith isn't a life on a mountaintop. A life of faith is a life in a community. But I don't think there's any formula, and I do think, as we were talking about earlier, that people have different faith gifts. That is, I know people who never doubted the existence of God. From the moment that they were conscious of themselves, they always knew God existed, never doubted it. And I can't say that for myself. I mean, for many years, I was quite the opposite. I was convinced God didn't exist. And even now, I sometimes feel like what the great Hasidic Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said about himself. He said, "I'm a moon man. My faith waxes and wanes." So.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.
My name is Carlton, and I work at the Center for Ethics, and I work primarily with undergraduate students. And in our conversations, some of my conversations with students lately, we've been dialoguing about Bill Maher and his particular film, Religulous or Ridiculous.
Yeah.
So there are a couple students here, and kind of for them, I want to ask, have you seen the film?
I wrote an editorial for the Los Angeles Times about the film.
Okay, so I guess you can.
And I'd be happy to send it to you. But I'll tell you what I thought. I'm sorry. Did I?
No,
okay.
It's to open
all right.
up.
Yeah.
That
No. All right. So I'll
conversation.
tell you what the editorial said basically. And I do send out a weekly, like 200-word message. And if anybody is interested, I'd be more than happy to put you on the list. And if anybody's interested, I'll take you off the list. Somebody's getting it and doesn't want to. But I said, you know what, I started off by saying I want to show a counterfilm called Scientifictious. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the world and I'm going to interview all these quack scientists, right, who aren't real scientists. And I'm going to throw in one or two real scientists for credibility. And then at the end, you'll see that science is really, you know, a crock. And it would have as much credibility as his film. Because it's not hard to find religious people who are either not sophisticated or charlatans, right? I mean, religion draws charlatans. We all know that. This is no surprise to anyone. Not only does it draw charlatans, but it also draws people like all of us of uneasy or uneven commitment. So there are some things they really believe in that they do, and some things they don't believe in so much. And, you know, it wouldn't be hard to make a film like that. And in fact, if he wanted to expose religious hypocrisy and silliness, I think that would be a fine thing to do. The problem was what he did was, with the exception of one or two people, and you notice there are one or two people in the film who give as good as they get, one of whom, by the way, interestingly enough, is the guy who plays Jesus at this theme park, and yet everything Marr asks him, he has a really thoughtful, considered answer to. And the other is this very impressive guy, the Vatican astronomer. And Marr kept him on film for a very short time because it was clear that the silliness that he found from other people wasn't going to find from this guy. The problem is that in a film that its defenders say was for laughs, at the end he says, we have to get rid of religion or the world's going to be destroyed. So he was trying to make a serious point, and you don't make a serious point about something by interviewing people who not only are ambushed because you know that, and he went on the website and said very explicitly that many of the people that he interviewed had no idea what he was doing or why he was interviewing them or what he was interviewing them about. But also you don't do it by interviewing people who can't stand up to you, right? He has to interview his peers. He can't, I mean, listen, it's not hard to make someone look ridiculous if you're very sharp and you're a comedian and you ambush them. But really, I didn't think that the film was so, I wasn't impressed, and I was sorry that that was what he spent his time doing. And if you want more details, I'd be happy to send you the article. So anyway, yes. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. By the way, I'm a real fan of yours, and your speaking here has saved me a trip to Los Angeles. I understand the point you're making about faith, and I can accept that, sociological, psychological, in terms of the benefits of having a faith. But there's a part of me that asks the question, what is it that I believe, and is that true?
Right.
And that question still comes up. And when I study the history of religions, I can look at the belief systems that generated these religions, a lot of them from barren deserts in the Middle East. And I think our thinking has changed since that time. So when I look at these religions and try to reconstruct them, I wonder what is left there for a 21st century person to really believe in terms of God, the nature of God, the attributes of God, and the things that are said in the Jewish Bible and in the New Testament.
Right.
A God that sends his chosen people out to slaughter villages doesn't seem to be a loving God. So I wonder, what kind of God could a person who sees the world this way really believe in? How can he connect to, he sees the universe and accepts the organization and the wonder of it, but what do you do with that wonder if you also question organized religions that profess to connect to this God?
Well, it depends also, a lot of this depends on what you understand Scripture to be, okay? So let me just give you a word or two about the way in which I read the Bible. I read the Bible by the light of the Bible. By that I mean certain principles and ideas and ways of life arise from the Bible that I use to criticize things in the Bible itself, which is how the Jewish tradition has always worked. So for a good example, I used this example last night. I said, look, and actually I used it in the book, and I'll probably use it tomorrow. Hillel, someone comes to Hillel, who was one of the greatest of the rabbis, and says to him, teach me the Jewish tradition on one foot. And he says, what's hateful to you, don't do to someone else. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. What I want to know is, how did he get that? How did he get that? Now, here was somebody who didn't read moral philosophy, whose entire life was steeped in the biblical text in which he read about how villages were destroyed. And my answer is that you can't read the Bible the way you read a textbook. You have to immerse yourself in its world, and from it will emerge the things that the Bible considers so important, such that someone who's thoroughly immersed in it, and only it, like Hillel, would say that's what the Bible's about. The tradition, as I understand it, and I think this is true of Judaism and Christianity, is a progressive, not always, I mean, 2 steps forward and 1 back, not always perfect, attempt to discern God's will through the experiences of those who sought to discern God's will both in ancient times and modern times. So I don't think there is, I mean, look, there's another easy example that rabbis love to cite about the rebellious son, where it says you should take a rebellious son out and stone him. And the rabbis, again, thoroughly immersed in the biblical text, after making various conditions about what constitutes a rebellious son, end up by saying, by the way, a rebellious son never was and never will be. because their sense of what the Bible is about made it impossible for the Bible to really mean that you should stone your own son. And so what I would say is organized religion is the attempt to continuously translate God's will into the world. And I want to say something in favor of organized religion in particular, not only because I represent it, although I can't divorce myself from what I do. But when someone says to me, I'm spiritual but not religious, my question to them is, how much do you give to charity? Because organized religion is an actual attempt to get people to do things on the basis of what they believe about God. That's why, by the way, organized religion is always problematic. Because, as Charles Péguy, the French Catholic activist, said, everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics. Right? So you start off with a revelation at Sinai and you end up with a synagogue board. But the thing is, if you don't have a synagogue board, then you don't have buildings, and you don't have fundraising, and you don't have ethics centers, and you don't have hunger drives, and you don't have people who stand outside my synagogue day after day, which they do, collecting cans from people in Beverly Hills and ferrying them down to West Los Angeles to people who don't have food to eat. And you don't get that. You just don't from someone who says, well, I'm not with organized religion because I feel very spiritual. So the truth is that organized religion is the imperfect translation of what we understand imperfectly to be God's will as it is reflected, I think, imperfectly in the Bible. And that's a lot of imperfection along the way, and it's going to be a lot of human division. But the alternative to that struggle is to assume that either God has no will, human beings can't discern it at all, or even though we have some inkling of it, we shouldn't do anything about it. So in the end, I throw my lot in with the first, knowing that I will often get it wrong, but that, say not the struggle, not availeth. So.
What would you believe if you didn't have a history of Judaism or Christianity or other religions?
I don't know. You're asking me what I would be if I wasn't me. And I don't know the answer to that. What I would say is that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all of them instantiate something real and powerful about the perception of God in the world. And I want to make this clear when I say this. People ask me, what's better about Judaism, right? Because obviously I'm Jewish and I represent the Jewish tradition. And I always say that that it is my job to argue Judaism's excellence, not its superiority. Right? I can't tell you. I mean, I never lived as a Christian. I never lived as a Muslim. It would be dishonest for me to tell you all the reasons why Judaism's better. Right? But I know from the tradition, I know from the inside. All I can tell you is that I feel like I'm heir to a great richness of seeking to understand God's Word. If I were not heir to that great richness, I think I'd be much poorer for it. And it would almost be like asking me, what language would you speak if you were brought into a world in which a language was never developed like English? And my answer is I would grunt, but I wouldn't be nearly as articulate. So.
Okay, I'm John. Thanks largely to the Ethics Center Associate Director. I'm an Ethics Center groupie. I also am in remission in the same way that you are, and my faith was deepened by the circumstances under which I became conscious of my remission. But that's not what I want to talk about. One of the things that has struck me is that religion is often associated with tribalism. Yeah. And when religion is associated, and with community, which are two sides of the same thing, right, in some ways. That is to say, it seems to me we live in community that goes beyond just our current communities, but both into the past and into the future. That sometimes gets turned into tribes, and tribes get into wars with each other, often using religion as an excuse for that, if not the deep at the ground reason for the wars. Right. Could you comment on that?
I think that that's exactly right. And here, although I've never actually thought about it in exactly this way, here I think America is a very good model in a sense. Why aren't there religious wars in America? After all, America is very heterogeneous, right? You would think there should be religious wars here. But I think that this subscribing to a transcendent ideal both helps eliminate that, and so does the idea that people have common interests and religious beliefs, and that those two don't completely overlap also helps that. So, yeah, it's true. Tribalism is a terrible, is a two-sided coin. I won't say it's terrible. It's a two-sided coin, right? And tribalism doesn't only afflict religion. It afflicts everything from soccer teams, as you know, or baseball teams, or football teams, or whatever, to my neighborhood versus your neighborhood. The trick, it's more than a trick, actually. The aim of all human life ought to be able to have close associations and yet not make that force you to see someone outside of that association as less than. But that's very difficult to do, and that's part of, look, here, let me just say something in favor of the Jewish tradition, since before I said I wouldn't talk about why it's better. Let me tell you something that's better about Judaism, is that it says in several places, and has always said, that the righteous of all the nations have a place in the world to come, which is a way of saying the evaluation of whether someone deserves eternity has to do with how they live their lives. And that seems to me to be a very salutary thing. It doesn't, it's explicit that it goes outside of the Jewish world. So if we can find some common ideal that we believe is, elevates human beings to our level, even if they don't share our beliefs, it would be good. But it is very hard to do. It's very hard to do. And that's one of the reasons why religions tend to be so inward focused, is the better you know someone else, the more it elevates that ideal, but the more it tends to diminish your tribal loyalties. So it's very, it's tough. This, by the way, was one of the reasons why I was so pleased when Rick Warren offered to write the foreword to the book, because he's not Jewish. He's the pastor of Saddleback Church. And I didn't even ask him. I was talking to him before a presentation that we were both giving. I started to tell him that I was writing this book. I thought maybe I'll get him to blurb the book after it's written. And no sooner were the words out of my mouth, I'm writing this book on faith, when he said, would you like me to write a foreword? And I went, sure, yes, you're Rick Warren. Of course I would. Right? You wrote A Purpose-Driven Life, which has sold more books than the Bible. So, yeah, of course I'd like to write a foreword. Right. So, But what struck me about it, in all seriousness, was he had come once and spoken at my synagogue. Okay, that was how I knew him, and then we were together at this. But he didn't know what was going to be in the book. And he knew I was a conservative rabbi, not an Orthodox rabbi. And yet, he volunteered to do it by transcending those lines. Even though I'm not evangelical, I'm not a Christian, and he was only at my synagogue once, he still said, I'll do it. And that, to me, is, it was a beautiful example of saying, because the essence of what you stand for, I believe, is good, I'm willing to sign on. So, we have time for a last, yeah?
I'm undergoing chemo now, so I'm not quite where you're at, but I'm curious about how that event affected your understanding and your faith and changed you.
First of all, I'm sorry for you. For undergoing it. And one thing that I will say is that, everyone knows this, but there are 1,000 things that happen to you when you undergo it that are very hard to transmit to someone else. And when you said that you were undergoing it, now I all of a sudden started to think back to all the stories that I remembered about myself that make this such a difficult process to undergo, because after all, it's both life-giving and also completely enervating, just drains you and drains your system, and makes you very grateful, by the way, for science. Enormously grateful, because, as I said, I didn't believe for a minute that, if there was no chemo and I just prayed hard enough, that I would be okay. And it does remind you how powerfully physical we are, because I felt like what Michael Kinsley said about having Parkinson's disease. He said when he was stricken with Parkinson's, he felt like he was an advanced scout for his generation about what old age was going to be like. And when I was going through chemo, I felt the same way. I mean, I was exhausted with an exhaustion that I never knew before. I mean, it wasn't a normal exhaustion. And I felt like I was an advanced scout for what I would be like if I was lucky enough to make it to an advanced age. But having said all that, here's what I felt more than anything, in addition to what I said before about it cracking open a part of you. I just want to add something else to that. And I'll go back actually previous to it. Two experiences. When I was being wheeled in for brain surgery, which was the most immediate, I could actually die now, because this is brain surgery. Now you always say it isn't brain surgery. This is actually brain surgery. And I remember thinking to myself, and I said, which Jews are supposed to say the Shema before they die. And I said to myself, as they first started to put in the IV that anesthetizes you, I said the Shema to myself because I thought I may never wake up. I really thought it was a genuine possibility. And here's what struck me. I was very sad for that possibility for my family. But even though I wanted to live longer, I was stunned to see that I wasn't, oh my God, how could I, you know, it's so unjust that I would die now. I didn't feel that. I felt an enormous pain if I would die that my family wouldn't have me, because I know what it would mean to them, but not for me, because I realized, and I realized this again when I had chemo, that I'm extravagantly blessed. And when people come into my office, I have this in the book, and they say, why me? They almost never come in and say, you know what, I was born in the richest country in the world. I've never gone hungry. Why me? Or, I had loving parents who brought me up in a good home. Why me? But the truth is that chemo reminded me, there I was. Look, I'm not going to kid you. There I was sitting in a private chemo place in Beverly Hills getting, you know, like, whatever. I'm sure there is no designer chemo, but if there had been, right, since the doctor who put me there is a member of my congregation, right, he wants to give the rabbi just the best chemo. I thought I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to go through this. And I was grateful to God that I had the life that I'd had thus far. And if this was going to be the end of it, I was still luckier than 99.9% of all the people who had ever lived. And so, by the way, if you're sitting in this room, are you? Without question, no matter what the circumstances of your life, if you're sitting in this room, right, given what human history has been, there may be one or two exceptions here, but by and large, 99.9. And therefore, really, it renewed my sense of gratitude. And I really believe would have renewed my sense of gratitude even had the doctor said to me at the end, I want you to know the chemo's not working. I mean, I would have been devastated. I would have been sad. But I would not have felt that I had a claim against God who had given me so much. And now that God was taking away all the muchness that he gave me, I'm going to say that's so unfair. Right? So it's hard to stay in that place. I grant you. If I walk out of, synagogue and I see that, I don't know, my car has a flat tire, I'm still going to get upset. But I know that that's actually where I belong. And I know that that's actually true. And I know that I'm incredibly lucky. And I see the other things as sort of natural faults and aberrations of character, but really I felt very grateful. And I'll just say one other thing that has nothing to do with theology, but for years I hadn't watched sports. For years and years and years. And I watched almost the entire season of football. And I bring this up for two reasons. One is football was great because it paralleled the violence that I felt going on inside of me. And it was very helpful to watch people hit each other. I got to tell you, it really was. And I read these wonderful mysteries by a guy who's now become a friend, the Irish mystery writer Ken Bruin, who writes very violent mysteries. And I thought, this is what's going on inside me. And the other part of it was that I watched football because I allowed myself to do it. In other words, this really is a time, especially if you're at all hard on yourself, not to be. So you should allow yourself things that you don't normally allow yourself because you're fighting a much bigger battle, and you don't need to give energies to small things like, why am I wasting my time watching football when I could, I don't know, be reading Nietzsche. And with that, thank you.
I taught him everything he knows. Books are for sale out in the hallway, and then David will be signing books in the Center for Bioethics, where you will see quite a spread, let me tell you. Really good food. So everybody's welcome to buy a book, have David sign it. If you brought your book, he's happy to sign it, and let's...
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.